this whole one size fits all national policy, while I guess easy to explain as part of an election platform, really doesn't provide an equal playing field to all Canadians.
Hey investors, Brother here from Watson Estates, and you're listening to the largest, fastest growing podcast for Toronto real estate on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. We'd like to be in the know, keep up to date, and inform friends like you on what's going on in our marketplace. If we're going to invest, we want to know where to put our investment dollars. And today we're doing something a little bit different and something special. Instead of doing just a general market update, as we like to do at the beginning of each month, with September behind us now, I thought, why not bring on a powerhouse, the president of the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board, to share with us some insight on what's going on. His name is Kevin Crigger. He's also the #1 for unit volume at his brokerage, Royal LePage, Johnston and Daniel, and a nice guy with lots of ideas. We see his name in the news, in the media all the time. And even still, he's come up with some interesting thoughts and considerations in our talk today. I know you're going to get some value. I sure did. And if and when you do, please leave us a like, leave us a comment, and share this on Instagram. You can tag us at Watson Estates. And I appreciate all the time you guys put into our show. Hopefully you're getting value, and it just really helps boost it when you guys kind of retaliate with showing support through engagements. But I hope you guys enjoy the show. Kevin, thank you for joining us on the show. How you doing?
Very well. Thank you very much for the invitation.
This is a fantastic time. I know we were kind of going back and forth for the last month or so, but we intentionally waited until the numbers came out for October for September, because we want a bit of an update on the last 3 quarters. Obviously, 2021 has been an interesting market. But before we head into a bit of an update for everybody today, maybe tell us a little bit about you and what do you do on a daily basis?
My name is Kevin Crigger. I'm president of the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board. I'm also a real estate broker with Royal LePage, Johnston Daniel. I've been licensed since January 7th of 2011. I'm an active realtor in Central and West Toronto predominantly, working both in resale and in pre-construction.
Awesome. So today, Kevin's a very busy guy, everybody. And if you have any comments or questions, you can hit the like button, support the show. But this is a special episode where we can kind of look over the last year. So maybe at a very high level, Kevin, if you could tell us what happened, give us a bit of an update of what's taken place so far this year.
Yeah, so basically we saw market conditions substantially tighten really from the beginning of 2021. I think the biggest story really is the pace of annual growth of sales is 3 times the rate of new listings coming to market. So obviously we still suffer from a substantial supply shortage. 2021, however, is substantially different from 2020. 2020 was largely demand driven for the low-rise sector, so single family homes. Whereas in 2021, we saw a substantial resurgence in the condo market, which is really fueling the pace of, obviously, sales. Yeah.
So what do you see for the next quarter? So looking in the next 3-4 months, what do we see coming? Is it going to continue with the condo, or do we see, has it kind of leveled out? What do you guys see this headed?
I think the biggest issue really is the supply shortage we're seeing. We've obviously seen some level of economic recovery. The labor market's incredibly tight. And with sort of restrictions starting to ease and, pace of sort of people back and forth, I think you're going to see continued demand and, unfortunately, a continued shortage of listings driving price.
Yeah. One of the things that I found interesting looking at over the last few months is things seem to slow down on the sales front. Obviously, it's all relative to number of new listings, but there was this conversation of things are slowing down. This is our opportunity to get back to normal. Prices are going to crash, all that fun stuff, which if you follow the numbers like you and I do, we knew this wasn't going to be the case. It only has gotten more tight. So now we look in the next few months, do you anticipate this fall and spring will look more in line with typical years, or do you see, like we saw in 2020, that it could be actually like a very early spring? We're talking January through March spring market.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest sort of factors will be the pace of immigration. So obviously we're looking at record or near record rates of immigration coming, based on government policy and sort of the move back to some semblance of normalcy with the flow of people. based on Toronto being sort of the benefactor of most of these new immigrants and, no substantial changes on the supply side coming, I think you're going to see a very active market really all through next year.
Yeah. And I tend to agree. So obviously we just had the federal election, which was interesting timing. There was a lot of pause actually in the market for a bit there until we had the final verdict. What impact do you see that having now that we kind of know where the cards have landed on that?
I think the interesting part is all of the federal parties had housing as sort of a top level campaign item that everyone sort of campaigned on. I think it speaks to the level of concern in the market around the lack of affordability in housing really now across the country. The Liberal plan certainly has some positives that will bridge the gap to a smaller degree for Torontonians. Obviously, the $40,000 savings program that they brought forward and some of the additional sort of incentives for first-time buyers. The unfortunate part is in Toronto, as you well know, based on our average price, $40,000 sadly often covers land transfer tax. It's not a substantial tool in a purchase, just based on our average price points. Whereas in other markets across the country, $40,000 could be your entire down payment. So one of the things that I certainly hope the government looks at is sort of a regionalized program. This whole one-size-fits-all national policy, while I guess easy to explain as part of an election platform, really doesn't provide an equal playing field to all Canadians. And I think if the government's looking to treat all Canadians fairly and equally, and all voters fairly and equally, they need to really look at a regionalized nature for a number of these sort of first-time buyer programs, if they're intended to have the same effect of buying power across the country.
It's a very interesting approach. I kind of like that. It's an interesting conversation. And the first I'm actually hearing of that, it reminds me very much of the first-time homebuyer incentive, where we've waited for years and it never caught ground because it wasn't positioned in a way that could actually support the Toronto buyer. So I think there's some validity to that, even if we don't look that far behind us. Yeah.
Well, most definitely there is. And, the challenge with all national policies or all provincial policies is real estate is by nature very, very local. And unless that sort of local nuance is looked at in the application of policy, you end up treating all of your constituents very differently. With a number of the federal plans, obviously including the Liberals, there was a lot of discussion around foreign buyers. And, I think for those of us living in Ontario, the reality is those policies that sort of artificially suppress demand have not been effective. We saw the Wynne government's fair housing plan, which obviously brought in a foreign buyer tax. Now, we had estimated foreign participation in the market was sort of in and around 5% or less. From 2018 to 2021, we've had a foreign buyer tax in Ontario, and yet we're still talking about substantial increases in prices and a general lack of affordability. So one of the biggest issues, I think, long-term has been a lot of government policies look to sort of enact change instantly and sort of get voter reaction instantly. So they always focus on demand. The challenge with sort of demand-based Band-Aid policies, they don't work. The only effective change that we can hope for in our market is substantial changes to policy that enacts supply. So, shortening development timelines, cutting the red tape, creating incentives for that sort of missing middle housing that bridges the gap between condo and house. Without those tools, we're really not going to see substantial change from, the frenzied pace of the market we've seen in the past and continue to see today.
Yeah, and very much that foreign buyer tax did have an impact, but it was short-lived, and it seemed more of a reflex response from the market that, as you've described, has only gotten much, much worse. Now, in a similar way, and to the detriment, I think, of the Liberal campaign, was this blind bidding statement that they made of removing that. I know TRREB, REA, and CREA all had very strong positions against that program. I'm curious, do you see, what are your thoughts on that? And what kind of discussions happening speaking of regional, on the local level of something like that today?
Well, I think the concern from TRREB's perspective is consumer choice. So the role of government really is to bring new tools to the table and provide new options. The idea that the government comes in with sort of a blanket statement and a blanket policy about sort of a very nuanced element of the sale process was certainly strange to me. As a homeowner, I would certainly be concerned that, the government is ultimately dictating how I sell the largest single asset, typically that I own. And a lot of the need for these conversations around, again, demand-focused changes really is based on the government's lack of initiative on supply. So I think focusing on important elements like the supply conversation really should be their primary objective. And also looking at a number of the sort of comments and elements of the homeowners' Bill of Rights that they brought forward shows that they clearly don't understand how real estate is transacted in Ontario. They talked about the legal right to a home inspection, which certainly may sound appealing to a consumer who's unfamiliar with the buying process. And it sort of sounds as though the government's giving you an additional right. The reality is, right in our standard form, there's an acknowledgement that you have a right to a home inspection. When it comes to agency disclosure, which was another sort of comment brought forward in the homeowners' Bill of Rights, we have agency documents for that very purpose. The confirmation of cooperation clearly illustrates if multiple representation is enacted in that specific transaction, and there's a requirement of consent by both parties. So my concern when people get involved in things that they don't fully understand is they really tend to sort of overstep their position. With blind bidding or the traditional offer process, there are multiple options available in our market currently. There is sort of an auction style option. There are a number of businesses that operate in that regard. And with TRREB, there certainly will be the ability for a more open and transparent offer process, which certainly should be a right of buyers and sellers to choose. But I think a blanket decision by the government to take away options from a home seller is concerning.
It'll be interesting to see if that takes the ability to do the auction, and if in fact that's chosen by sellers and the buyers. And kind of, I think this is maybe a good time to have this conversation just for a moment. We just recently did an episode talking about steering, and there's a lot of pushback right now. And one of the major recommendations out of that documentary, very interesting one. And again, everyone can look back at my thoughts on some of the things they brought up, but with regard to the steering, one of the suggestions they had was to create some independent committee to review the industry. That was one of the suggestions. Does this just kind of lead to that same circle? Are we kind of moving around in a bit of a circle here, or is there something just like we kind of do with TRREB? What should the review process of making sure consumers are protected and that realtors are following their obligations? What does that look like in the coming months, in the coming years?
Well, speaking of steering specifically, steering 100% is illegal. It's not a practice that has any place in our profession and is already, based on our regulatory framework, is illegal, unethical. I could go on. In terms of regulation of our profession, the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board isn't the regulator. The Real Estate Council of Ontario is. It's a governmental agency that basically has licensing power and also has power for discipline. we have professional standards. We have a professional standards process at the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board. And we hear cases, obviously, month after month, year after year. But really, it's our regulator who needs to be active in these conversations. And it's our regulator who ultimately enforces the act under which we're governed.
In defense of consumers. So this
Most
is why
definitely.
I found that to be a very interesting recommendation, but just wanted your thoughts on that. So when we look to the horizon, the next 5 years, which is a long time, but let's try our best. What do you see? What comes next in our market? If there are solutions, what are those solutions? Or where do you see things going if we were to be realistic with where we're headed now?
Well, I think the reality is the federal election highlighted that housing is an issue for everyone. Rental housing, owned housing, we have a shortage in both areas. So I think that there's a common agreement among all levels of government. This is a problem. TRREB's been sounding the alarm on this for the last decade. And it's certainly comforting to see that it's becoming a national conversation and one sort of at the highest levels across the country. So recognizing there's a problem is obviously the first step in finding a solution. I think really all three levels of government acting in some sort of coordinated way is going to be the most important element to address our supply concerns. So the federal government, a lot of the sort of policy initiatives they talked about, some of their goals and objectives really aren't attainable exclusively as the federal government. So there's going to have to be a lot of close working together with the provincial government and most specifically with the municipal government. That's ultimately where land use planning is done. It's also where building permits are issued and ultimately where construction is going to occur. So I think, finding some coordinated relationship at the municipal level is going to be the most important piece of that puzzle in terms of moving supply forward. In order for the GTA and the Greater Golden Horseshoe to remain competitive, and we've seen strong economic growth. A lot of it's really been driven by immigration. We need immigration to continue to grow. And in terms of people coming here, they have to have somewhere to live. So housing is going to play an ever-present role in the sort of strength of our economy moving forward. And I really think with these conversations, it's going to probably take 5 years to see any substantive change in supply. But I think that there is such consensus, largely for the first time ever, that we might actually see positive progress in the supply side of the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And there almost seems to be an emergency reflex when we were talking at the federal level in preventing investment unless people move into the area. I find it interesting. There hasn't been as much discussion on the amount of immigration that policy put in place. The increase was a direct result of COVID. So I'd be interested to see how that kind of pans out. But no doubt, if we're going to maintain the demand that you're describing, which is very, very large, then supply needs to be tackled yesterday, 10 years ago, right?
Most definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there are ways to do that fairly quickly. Looking at the development process in Toronto specifically, a developer makes an application for a height of, let's say, 25 stories, and generally through a negotiation and consultation process, that building gets knocked down in height, to 20 stories, for example. Now, in certain neighborhoods, the reduction in density from the application makes a ton of sense. And, not all applications are equal. Some are certainly reflective of precedents in a neighborhood. Some are coming from absolute left field. So there's no suggestion that, development applications should be accepted as they are. However, there should be a conversation around overall height. So to go from 20 stories to 25 stories in a transit-oriented corridor that, doesn't shadow neighboring residential or what have you, to reduce for the sake of reducing makes no sense. And, once the building is up, you're never getting additional density. Whatever the finished height is what the finished height is. Adding in 2 stories, 3 stories, 5 stories instantly brings additional housing to market. And the difference in timing over the construction period, you're probably looking at a matter of weeks per floor, as opposed to years to bring a new building to market. So I think that there is the possibility to augment the existing supply that's coming to market now, and look at ways to sort of bolster it on a go-forward basis.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Are there any other ideas circulating at TRREB or that you have personally about dealing with the affordability crisis? One of the ones that strike out beyond, there seems to be a bit of debate over whether to sprawl into the Greenbelt and surrounding communities. But as far as local and at the municipal level, this yellow belt, this infill, obviously with a lot of pushback by some residents, is that something that that TRREB would support, that we should, focus on those areas? And what kind of work is being done? Is that going to help?
Well, I think the missing middle has been the biggest conversation at TRREB, and certainly one of the biggest conversations we've had with government, in that that's really where we have a substantial lack of supply. So, looking at the things that bridge the gap between single family home and condos, so, townhomes and what have you, there's certainly the ability in a number of locations throughout the city to bring supply to market. The challenge is the smaller the development, generally the less financially feasible, largely based on the timelines of sort of the approval process and the various sort of elements of red tape that are involved. So looking at how to incentivize those styles of development that aren't exceptionally dense, but provide additional housing units over a single family home, I think that's really where substantial supply could be brought to market fairly quickly, because the actual construction process is much faster. But it's finding ways to make them financially feasible to developers. And that's really going to be done at the municipal level.
It's tragic to see developers running away from development, and though you have incentives for affordable housing stuff, they will actually lean towards single family, which creates further issues. And we use the terminology missing middle. I think the term itself actually interferes a lot with what we're trying to accomplish, because exactly like you're saying, this is a very easy and quick way for us to convert, and we're seeing a bit of a boom in laneway housing and stuff like that, but being able to convert into multiple units and all of these ideas, I think, are very simple if in a lot of ways we just get out of the way. And it is rather unfortunate. I haven't mentioned it much on the podcast, so I'm thank you for bringing that up. The timelines to get those done is so much quicker and at a larger scale as well, because we're not just relying on the hands of developers to do something that might be not in their best interest financially, but we're creating an opportunity for smaller developers or people looking to get into development to also contribute to that, because the numbers are large. We need to be able to satisfy them.
Well, definitely. And even individual investors. I've owned a number of properties. I bought a property in Little Portugal, for example, and worked on a conversion from a single family home that was in very rough condition to a multi-unit property. The approval process and all of the sort of back and forth was unbelievably lengthy. I think, construction took probably 10 months. And I think the approval process probably took equally as long. And at the end of the day, it's basically, 3 housing units in a semi-detached house in a neighborhood with tons of multi-unit properties. So looking at how to sort of streamline that process for a couple of reasons. One, it incentivizes people to do things legally and to do them the right way, with full permits and approvals in place, but it also provides an opportunity for additional housing units without substantial additional demands on the neighborhood. Interestingly, the tenants who are in the property, none of them have cars, because it's quite transit accessible. It's an incredibly walkable neighborhood. So it's not that bringing these 3 households into one property has added to, demand for off-street parking, for example. So I think really looking at how all of these different initiatives for smaller investors, smaller builders and contractors, and smaller developers, there's obviously many more of them than there are large development companies in the city. And anything we can do to sort of motivate that group to bring housing units to market and increase density throughout the city, I think is an important one.
Yeah, I love it. Team effort. It's really a team effort at political and at a civil level. So for those who are considering moving to the GTA, I recently saw a report with, I can't give the specific numbers, but they were looking essentially at the next 10 years. And it was more of a challenge to Toronto to say, can you satisfy the demand for young families to create that missing middle? If you can't, the response is going to be further spreading of the Toronto population. So you're essentially turning them over to, and it's a small win for the suburbs. With all of these things in mind, more likely than not, unless we can really buckle down, there's going to be a continued strain on these families. So what would you say to those families as they're kind of navigating where they're going to grow?
Well, I think looking at, obviously the financial consideration is key, but also looking at the different housing types available to you. I grew up in the suburbs, and, for a large part of my life, I didn't know there was anything other than a single family house, with, a backyard and a 2-car garage and a 4-car driveway. That was sort of what I grew up knowing. The reality is there's a number of different housing types throughout the city. There's a project that we had the great privilege of working on, Upper East Village, which is a condo development in Leaside. It's certainly not your typical condo. They're larger in size, 2+ den and 3-bedroom options. And we're starting to see more and more of those across the city. Looking at some of the sort of townhouse opportunities as well in sort of more urban centers. If as a family you are able to sort of live with 1 car, there's a substantial savings from having a 2nd car if you're both commuting to work, living in a more suburban location. So I think looking at different opportunities and maybe looking at some lifestyle changes, you'll see that there certainly are more opportunities than just the sort of larger suburban homes that many of us were much more accustomed to. And then we've also had clients who, through the help of mom and dad, have been able to bolster their down payment and have co-invested in some multi-unit properties, for example. So I think thinking outside of the box and sort of looking at a wider range of options is certainly one way to address the obviously vast supply challenges we have in our market.
And with that in mind, one of the other ideas I've heard circulating is this idea of taking an existing duplex or triplex and severing it into a miniature condo, whatever that process looks like, to create additional, not just housing for renters, but actual housing for purchase. So there's a lot of creative ideas surfacing, which is really good that we're now at the table talking about affordability. And as some of these things come, I guess the call to those entering or looking to stay or move to the GTA is that they come, right? They come, let us, but in response, we need to be able to step up with that missing middle, in that middle ground. Yes, you might not have access to a detached, but what good is a detached anymore anyways when you have access to transits, more environmentally friendly, and you can live in such a beautiful city? I think there is a happy middle where we can meet them. So let me leave you with, you look like you're going to say something.
No, I think that there definitely is a happy medium. And I think really looking at what Toronto has to offer on a global scale. We have incredible cultural institutions, great restaurants, a really sort of inclusive and safe city. I think it stacks up well compared to other major cities around the world. And, for newcomers coming to Toronto, I think being immersed in that city is really important. And in order to be immersed, it's looking at different housing stock as well.
Yeah. Okay, here's a fun question. This is more of a lob. I'm curious your thoughts on if there is a bubble. It's a very clicky, and that's why we put it at the end, because I don't want this to be a clicky podcast, but why not? We'll have a little bit of fun. What are your thoughts on this concept of us being in a bubble, things being disconnected from fundamentals in Toronto? How does this all equate? And I guess with the idea of a bubble is there a risk of it deflating and overheating and therefore punishing the people who invest locally?
I There's been talk of a real estate bubble longer than I've been licensed. Sometime in the sort of mid 2000s is sort of when I remember first hearing of the sort of Toronto real estate bubble. I think if you look at historic numbers, other than in 2018, which was largely based on government intervention with the Wynn housing plan, we haven't really seen any dips in overall market activity and price. And I think the rationale for that is really the supply-demand dynamics. We've been in a supply-challenged market, which has only gotten more substantial and compounded year after year after year. The reality is we don't have enough supply. We don't have enough supply coming to market. And Toronto still is the sort of center point of people coming to the country. So fundamentally, I don't see that changing. Over time, which supply is generally a very long conversation because you can't snap your fingers and build, I think as supply rises to meet demand and meet the deficit that we currently have, certainly prices will moderate, but I don't see a bubble that we're living in.
Yeah. Yeah. In one sense, you can say there's a disconnection between income levels and price, or rent rates and price. But back to your point, when you look at the fundamentals of supply and demand, which is really the root of all of the fundamentals, there's no question in droves, there's demand, and supply has been short for so long. And it seems to be compounding year over year, which is why it's an emergency. I mean, we're in a situation where there needs to be things done.
Well, and also we have to be cautious that, this trend doesn't continue to the sort of Manhattanization of Toronto. Certainly looking at, housing prices in New York compared to incomes in New York City, you have generally a wealthier population in the center and everyone else sort of being pushed further and further away from the center as prices increase. To have a vibrant city in Toronto, it's important that we have a balance of housing so that people who work in the city are able to live in the city or in close proximity to the city. Because we also don't have, the best of the best in transit infrastructure. It's great to see that additional infrastructure is coming online, but we're a long way from having a wholly accessible city via public transit.
Yeah. Now, that's an interesting concept, the Manhattanization. I've never heard that thinking, but you're right. And in a way, we see it, but I think that comes back down to policies and making sure that doesn't happen. It'd be interesting to continue to track that, but this has been a really good interview relating to the last few quarters. And thank you for some of your thoughts and speaking on behalf of TRREB and contributing to the show. Where can folks find you and be able to kind of continue to monitor what some of these changes look like?
So looking at TRREB.ca, we obviously publish all of our market reports, and we have a great deal of information available about the city and obviously trends within the real estate space.
Yeah. So guys, you can check that out, Toronto Regional Real Estate Board. And Kevin, this has been a really good chat. Folks, if you can support the show, please hit the like button, leave us a comment if you have any questions or thoughts on the market. Obviously, there's a lot of moving parts here and a lot of directions we could have gone, but hopefully we were also concise and give a little bit of thoughts on how the real estate industry perceives our market. But Kevin, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.